So in today's lesson, section 8.4, you will need your Skills Practice 8.4 worksheet, which can be found on the Canvas page under this video link. Now, if you recall from our previous couple days of lessons, we were talking about the idea of factoring. And we sort of left off with the idea of how do I undo what it was I did. Now, what I want you to think about through this section is what is our ultimate goal? And so remember that in chapter 7, we learned how to FOIL this. So 2x plus 2x squared, sorry, plus 2x plus 1x plus 1. And then we simplified that to get 2x squared plus 3x plus 1. And so in the last lesson with our factoring, we actually started at this point here. This is where we had been working with that grouping line where we had 4 terms and we were looking for the GCF. And so what we did was we had broken it into 2 groups. We found that common factor between the 2, which ultimately led to the 2 binomials that were multiplied together to give me this line right here. So this line we had done in chapter 7, which gave us this line and eventually the 3rd line. What we're doing in this chapter is how do I get from here all the way back up to here and find the 2 binomials that I actually multiplied together. Now we started in the middle here in our last lesson in 8.2 where we used those 4 terms, my first, outer, inner, last, broke it up into 2 groups of parentheses which eventually led to this. So this lesson today is going to start from here. How do I get from this quadratic expression here all the way back to the 2 binomials that multiplied it together? And so that's what we're doing today. So we're going to start out, and so the first thing you need to do is to understand where some of those pieces came from. And you know, that idea of that first, outer, inner, last. And so this ultimate value right here is the result of adding together the outer and the inner terms. And so we need to figure out what were the outer and the inner terms. So, you know, it was product. We multiplied things together, okay, to get the 2x. We multiplied 2 things together to get the 1x, but when I added them together, they ultimately gave me 3x. So I need to figure out what 2 things did I add together to give me 3x, okay, that would ultimately have been the product of something else. So that's where we're going to start. So we need to start with a trick. What you need to understand is that this is the A, the B, and the C. The standard form of a quadratic is ax squared plus bx plus c, where a, b, and c are numerical values, okay? And so it's understanding what the a and the b and the c will give us. So I have a trick to figuring out how to break this apart. I have to figure out how to break this apart to find those 2 inner terms, that outer inner term of FOIL that made that. Now remember, 5x could be a 4 and a 1, or it could be a 3 and a 2. And so we need to figure out which one is it. So my trick is to make this little x here. And the top of the x is always going to be the product of a and c. So what is a? A is 2, c is 2, so that's 2 times 2, which gives me 4. Okay. The bottom number will always be the b. Okay. And so to figure out how to find out what 2 numbers did I multiply together that added together to give me the 5. So the idea here is what 2 numbers, okay, multiplied together that give me 4, but when I add them together, give me 5. Now remember, I made the comment about how this could be a 3 and a 2, the sum of the 2, or a 4 and a 1. Okay, so the idea is, okay, if I multiply these 2 together, what do I get? Well, 3 times 2 is 6, it's not 5, and 4 times, or sorry, is 6, not 4, but 4 times 1 is 4, and when I add them together is 5. So let's take a look here. So the idea here is what two numbers, so these two are the two I'm looking for, okay? If I multiply them together, they give me 4, but if I add them together, they give me 5. Had it been a 3 and a 2, the 3 times 2 would have given me a 6, which doesn't match this value up here. And it would match the bottom, but it doesn't also match the top. So how do I use that? So what we're going to do is we always bring down the first term. These become my outer and my inner terms. So my variable is x, so 4x plus 1x, and I'm going to always bring down the outer term of 2. Now, if you think about it, I'm going to go back a slide. It looks like this inner term right here. Okay, what I did was I broke this middle term apart into the two things that if I multiply them together, okay, they're going to give me the 2 that I want, but when I add them together, they're going to give me the 3. And so what I've done is I've broken this apart into that grouping line. So now we can use our technique. Whoa! We can use our technique from our last lesson, and I can break these two apart. And so I'm looking for the GCF, which is 2x, which leaves me with x plus 2. I really want an x plus 2 in the second one, so they share a common 1, and left behind is x plus 2. Remember, the idea is that I would redistribute that to get this line back here. They share an x plus 2 in common. So this is the GCF between the product here, so x plus 2. And what is left over? 2x plus 1. And so if I FOIL that, x times x give me 2x squared. The outer terms, x times 1 is 1x. Here's my 1x. 2 times 2x gives me 4x. And then the last two terms, 2 times 1 gives me 2. It gives me this grouping line again, which we know will give me that first line back. Let's try another one. So again, looking at the idea here, here is my A, my B, and my C, and the top of my little x is the product of A and C. It's always the product of A and C, and then the bottom is going to be my B value, my middle term. So A times C gives me -10, B is 9. Now, this one's a little tricky. What two numbers multiplied together that give me -10, but add together to give me 9? So if we're thinking about the factors of -10, we have -2 and 5. We have 2 and -5. I also have 10 and -1 and -10 and 1. So which pair, when multiplied together, give me -10, but then when I add them together, give me -9. And so if you look at the combination, -2 times 5 is, yes, -10, but when I add them together, that's actually a 3. If I take 2 times -5, yes, it's -10, but when I add them together, it gives me -3. I need a 9. 10 times -1 is -10. When I add them together, it gives me a +9. That looks like the winner. Let's just look at the last set. -10 times 1 is -10, but -10 plus 1 gives me -9. I need a +9, so it looks like 10 and -10 are my two values. Always bring down the first term. Remember, we're creating the grouping line. We have plus 10s minus 1s. So we're using these to break apart that 9s to come up with our middle two terms, bring down the last term, and now we're going to use our grouping symbols. So we're going to group the first two and the next two. What is the GCF? 2s. Take that out, gives me s plus 5. I need an s plus 5 over here. They're all negatives. So that tells me that I need to take out a -1. That gives me a positive s. Taking a -1 out of a -5 gives me a positive 5. You can redistribute to prove it. Okay, that we have it right. They both share the s plus 5 in common. What is left over? 2s minus 1. That becomes my second binomial. If I refoil this, I will get this line back. When I simplify it, I get my original quadratic expression back. Let's try another one. Again, using the idea of, do I have A times C, which is 30, 2 times 15. That middle term, so now we have a negative 11 in the bottom. So two numbers multiplied together that give me a positive 30, but add together to give me a negative 11. Well, we can think about 15 and 2. Well, that's a 13, so that's not going to work at all, whether it's a 17 or a 13. Okay, that's not going to work for us. So we also have a 6 and a 5. That sounds promising. Well, what I can tell you is that if I have a negative number here and this one is positive in that order, I know both of my terms are going to be negative. So negative 6 times negative 5 gives me a positive 30, but when I add together, they're going to give me that negative 11. Now we can go through and test, okay, what about negative 15 and positive 2? But the problem is that this A times C is a positive, and the only way I can get a positive is they're both positive or they're both negative. Okay, but because this middle guy is negative, then that means both of them have to be negative. So this is my two groups. So I have t squared, 2t squared, minus 6t, minus 5t. I always bring down the last term. Going to use my grouping symbols. Take out the GCF of 2t, which is t minus 3. Going to take out a negative 5, which is going to give me a t minus 3. Remember, if I redistribute, t minus 3 is the first one because they both share t minus 3 in common. And the piece that's left over is going to be the 2t minus 5. 2t minus 5. FOIL it, we'll get that same answer back in 5. Now 7 is going to be a little unique for us. We hadn't necessarily talked about this. So if I create my x, remember this is A times C, which is going to give me negative 2. My bottom term's a positive 1. So because of this combination here, I know that I'm going to have opposites. This one has to be positive, this one has to be negative, or negative positive, but I know they're going to be opposites. So the only way I can get a 2 by a product is through 2 and 1. So the question is it 2 minus 1 or is it 1 minus 2? So I have a positive 1 down here, so the larger number has to be positive, and so these become my two middle terms. And so we have 2y squared plus 2y minus 1y minus 1. We use our grouping symbols. So we end up with 2y. So I have y plus 1. Remember, I have to have a placeholder because I took the 2y. Going to take out a negative 1, and that leaves me with y plus 1. You can check out, by redistributing, it all works. What's left over? 2y minus 1's left over, so that becomes my second binomial. So let's try one more. Interestingly enough, this guy right here, so let's multiply the first and last term. The a and the c gives me a negative 12. Middle 2 gives me negative 3. So let's think about this. To get that negative 12, we're talking about 6 and 2, 12 and 1, 3 and 4. Okay, now because of the combination of negative, negative, they actually are going to be opposites. The only way I can get that is through opposites. So 6 plus 2, or 6 minus 2 is 4. That doesn't work. 12 minus 1 doesn't work. 6 minus 2 still gives me a 4. Negative 6 plus 2 gives me a negative 4. 3 minus 4 gives me negative 1. Negative 3 plus 4 gives me 1. Negative 12 plus 1 gives me 11. This one, there isn't a combination of two numbers that give me a negative 12, but at the same time give me a negative 3. So interestingly enough, right now, until you get to Algebra 2, this guy's going to be considered prime. Okay, so there aren't two numbers. This one ends up going to have decimals and things like that as part of its answer. Okay, So your work for tonight is to do the evens on the skills practice page 2 through 14. You will have one prime. Good luck.